Um, let's get started. Hello, let's get started because we have only like 90 slides to go through tonight, so we have to be a bit quick. And they are good slides. A lot of them are like reviews from what we have done so far, so that you know where we are coming from. So tonight is one of the more interesting lectures because now things are coming together. We are going to be able to connect the dots. So far, whatever we have learned has been basics to get here, and now by the end of the lecture tonight, you will be able to do like 80% of your coursework. So, because I know next week there won't be any lectures, it's your recess week, so you don't have anything to do, and you wanted to have something to do, so you can work on your courseworks, and that's perfect timing. Anyway, let's start with a quick recap from what we learned last time. In last lecture, we talked about segmentation. The idea behind segmentation is to have a classification for individual pixels. So there are two types of problems here. One is classification. You have an image. You are asked, what is it? Is it a cat or a dog? There may be a background. There may be a car in that image. But regardless, because you have images of cats and dogs, you are going to say, this is a cat. You don't care about the background of the image. In segmentation, you are going to say which pixels are the ones that make the dog or make the cat. So you're going to be able to draw lines around that particular object. So that's the main difference between segmentation and classification. So technically speaking, segmentation is also a sort of classification because individual pixels are now going to have a label. But in classification, the whole image is going to have a label. So we learned some techniques like thresholding. We said if the values are over a limit, they are the object, or under it, they are the object, or the other way around, they are the background. We learned about hysteresis thresholding, where we have two thresholds, and we said something in between those values is the object. Or like outside these two values is the object, depending on how we define the problem. We talked about clustering, which you are all familiar with. And we could cluster pixels according to the brightness values that they had. And then we talked about watershed. We briefly talked about active contours and graph cuts, which are also other techniques for segmentation. And the general idea is to minimize the energy, minimize the difference inside our segmentation area and outside it. So we were looking at internal energy and external one. Implicit and explicit. So we have the color as well, which was a very good source for segmentation. We could find, for example, the skin tone in images, but we have to be careful because sometimes the objects that are in the images are going to distract us from what we are actually going to achieve. So depending on the task that we have, we are going to use different colors and different feature methods. Now, what we are going to learn tonight is just a small list of feature extraction. We are going to see what features mean and how we can extract them from images. And also tonight, in 1 hour, you are going to learn supervised learning. So most of you have taken machine learning courses and neural computing, and so most of you are familiar with what machine learning is. But tonight we are going to start from scratch. We are going to see where a neuron comes from, how we can create a perceptron, how we can create a neural network, multi-layer perceptron, and support vector machines and some other sources of classifiers. So as you have different backgrounds, I start from scratch by defining what a classification means. So imagine you are applying for a mortgage and you want some money. So what you do is you put together some information from yourself and apply to a bank, and they reject you, or sometimes they accept. So they have some criteria. They look at your age, your income, and some like education, marital status, and things like that. So they have a lot of information from their previous clients. They have done risk analysis, and they see like if a person is married, is more likely to return our money, maybe, or I don't know, maybe the other way around. So they have their own risk data, which is called labeled data. So they have a lot of data from previous clients, and they know if a person with this particular character, with this particular age, occupation, is likely to return their money or not. So what they do is they have some labeled data. For example, in this case, let's assume they only care about your age and wealth. So if you are young and wealthy, good for you, and you're most likely going to be approved because most probably you have enough time to return that money, and most probably you have enough money to return that money. So if you're old and poor, then it's not very likely to be approved for a mortgage. So just as an example, I don't know how they do it, but this is just an example. So we have some examples here. We have some negative cases which are rejected, and we have some positive cases. So if you're wealthy and young, it's most probably going to be an approval, and if you're old and poor, it's most probably going to be a refusal. But some cases are straightforward. If I am 90 years old and I don't have any money, it's most probably, there is no thinking about it. It's a straightforward reject. If I am 20 years old and I have 10 million pounds in my account, then it's most probably an approval. But the borderline is where we are worried about. If I am 35 and I have 2,000 pounds, or if I am 36 and I have 20,000 pounds, how would this play? Which is the borderline for them to decide? So what we do is we draw a line. So this line is our classifier. So this is just as simple as that. A classifier is a line. I have a line, and I say, whatever input I have, I multiply it into the values of that line. If it is over, in this case it's an approval, and if it is under, it's a refusal. And for the borderline, if it is on the line, you can decide. You say, okay, I'm going to take risks. It's an approval, or I'm not. It's a refusal. So now I have a new application, and this one is automatically a refusal, looking at my line. But is this line the optimal one? What if I had drawn different lines? So you can see based on the way you draw your lines, you might end up with different results. So if I start with this line or this line, I am refusing this application, but if I start with this line, I am going to approve it. So in classification, we try to find a line and hopefully the optimal line. So now we have an idea what classification is. Let's look at images. How do we draw that line in images? The values that I have, for example, I want to say whether this is a cat or a dog. What computer sees is a bunch of numbers, intensity values. In a grayscale image, you have some values between 0 to 255 in a 1 byte setup. So this is what the computer sees. How is the computer supposed to look at these numbers and understand that this is a cat? So what I want, ideally, is a line that is drawn between a lot of these numbers and tells me if these numbers look like this or look like that, it's going to be a cat, and if they don't look like this or look like that, this is not a cat. But to come up with this line, what is the simplest way I can do is to encode all possible images in the world, store it in a computer, and say, whatever new image I have, I'm going to see which category it is. But this is not practical, as we discussed before, because if I have a 12 megapixel image, I'm going to have 36 million dimensions in 3 colors, and the number of possible images that I can draw or have is going to be 16.7 million to the power of 12 million, which is a very, very, very big number. It's impossible to even calculate it. So it is not impossible, but it's going to be thousands of lines for the number of the bytes that you're going to need. So we don't have that luxury. We cannot store all possible images and do that. And on the other hand, as I discussed before, if I have a picture of my hand like this, if it is like that, now it's a totally different set of numbers. As you could see in the previous image, all those grayscale numbers are going to change significantly. So it is not going to work unless, again, I have all of the possible images stored in my model. So image classification tries to find a solution to this problem by extracting features from images. As we discussed, and you remember, we had that image of a handwritten text which wasn't actually real characters, but we could still read it. So the features that were in that image were enough. We could use that. So image classification is also trying to use the features that we can extract from images to use it for classification. So this is Caltech 101 data set. It has 101 classes of objects and 1 class of background. Oh. Again, so it has 101 classes of objects and 1 class background. There are different data sets online, Caltech 256, soccer, flowers, scenes, and nowadays the most famous one, the most practical one is ImageNet, which has millions of images, and most people are using that. But you can try your models. Tonight in the lab, you are going to play with Caltech 101. You are going to download it and see how you can classify images. So you will learn enough tonight to do that. What are the challenges in image classification? As discussed before, you are going to be able to deal with different viewpoints of the same object, different colors of the same object, scale, background, occlusions, shape, rotation. So your model has to deal and come up with a trade-off between selectivity and invariance. It has to be selective enough to say this is a cat and this is a dog, and it also has to have invariance to say these cats are all cats. Although they look very different, maybe the colors are different, maybe the faces look very different, but they are still cats. So this is what your model has to be able to deal with. If your model says everything is a dog, it's already 50% correct, right? Because it's classifying 50% of the cases correctly. And if it says everything is a cat, again, 50% correct. So going from 50% higher is where you're starting. And if you have multi-classes, you are trying to separate different objects. Then let's say you have 4 classes. So you, by default, any random model is 25% correct. So you're trying to improve on that. So depending on the data set, this is also very important to consider. Depending on the data set that you are dealing with, you are going to use different sorts of features. For example, in soccer data set, which is different teams. So what you have to do is to find the players' clothes, basically, because they're all human, they're all, usually in this data set, they're all male, and the background is always the same thing. So if in the background you see an advert for a PS4, it shouldn't be the one that is misleading you to say this is a specific team. Or in another image you see another airline advertisement, it shouldn't be this distracting you from a real classification. Also, sometimes the names on the player's shirt might be the advertisement for that team, and it might be a clue, it might be helpful. But here, in this data set, what is most important is the color and the pattern of the clothes, right? But if you're dealing with another data set, for example, Caltech, you are going to have different variations in viewpoint, scale, rotation, and things like that. So depending on the data set that you're going to deal with, you're going to extract different features. Okay, speaking of features, the features we know so far are edges and corners, right? So we learned how to run a kernel through the image to extract edges, corners, and tonight we are going to develop on that, see how we can use that information even better. One way for detecting borders or edges, basically, borders of the objects in the images or the edges in the images, is we learned about difference of Gaussian, we learned about Gaussian filtering, we learned about Laplacian of Gaussian. So, yeah, we haven't learned about difference of Gaussian. Laplacian of Gaussian, we learned about Gaussian filters, we learned about Sobel and some other filters, which are just some kernels that you convolve on your image, right? Or Canny, so there are different people have come up with different names for their own filters. Another way is called Gabor filters. As you can see, they have this sort of sinusoidal plane of a particular frequency and orientation, modulated by a Gaussian envelope. You don't need to know this equation. I'm just putting some examples here. There is a toolbox in MATLAB, or in this one you can just go through more details if you like. But generally, Gabor filters look something like this. And they also help us extract edges in the images. And they are very similar to the V1 features in our brain. So most of the papers that are trying to start with biologically inspired models for object detection and classification, they use Gabor filters because they are a very good representation of V1 filters. And if you apply using this code that is available, if you apply Gabor filters on this image, if you apply it with different sizes and orientations, you will come up with different results. So if I want to understand that a particular edge in an image has which orientation, I can apply different Gabor filters of different orientation, right? And for each of them, see the response here. And the values that I have in these filters, if, say, a vertical one here is higher, then I say this pixel is most probably on a vertical edge. Or if 45 degrees is higher, then I say this is probably on a 45 degrees edge, right? So with this bunch of filters, I can calculate the orientation of the border that I have. So I apply all of these filters, and then I see which one is more powerful. The simpler way, this one I just wanted to say, on MathWorks website, there is a place called MATLAB Central File Exchange, where people who have written code which does a specific task, they upload it as a zip file, and you can log into your MathWorks account and download the code and use it. So some of the functions that do not exist in MATLAB directly, people have written them here, and you can just download them. So the simpler way for detecting the orientation of an edge, of a location in an image, is just computing the gradients. So what we had before, we had two kernels. You remember these two, right? These are edge detectors. So we could detect the vertical and horizontal edges using these two filters, right? So what I do here is I'm going to apply these two filters on my image. And for any particular pixel in my image, I'm going to have two different values, right? So one is going to be its vertical magnitude, and the other one is going to be its horizontal magnitude, right? Simples, right? So once I calculate these two values, I just take the square root of the squared sum of these two values that I have calculated, and that is the magnitude. So if I have that image, and on a particular image in the horizontal, I get 0.7, and on the vertical one, for the same pixel, I get 0.3. So what I do is I calculate this value. This is going to tell me the magnitude, and then I calculate the orientation with this equation that you have, arctangent the y over x. So it would be the arctangent of the vertical over horizontal, something like that. So with these two calculations for any individual pixel, I'm going to be able to calculate the orientation and magnitude of the edge in that particular point. Does it make sense? Right? It's a very, very simple idea. Do I need to repeat it, or did anyone understand? No, good. Okay. So you remember for edge detection, what we said was we can have this filter. You remember this one, this equation? The value to the right minus the value to the left over 2. So forget about the over 2 bit here. So what I have is minus 1, 0, 1. So if I run this on my image once, so I have a set of values. Let's say and so on. So this is my horizontal edges, and this is my vertical edges. And now for every particular point, if I calculate this, I have the magnitude, how strong that point is. If both of these values are 0, what does it mean? It means I don't have an edge here. But if one of them is 1 and the other one is 0, it means I have a vertical edge or horizontal edge, depending on the values that I have here, right? Okay? So I can calculate the magnitude and orientation of that particular point, that particular pixel. So how can I use that? Now that I have this, I can create a histogram again. So I will say, for every individual pixel, I have calculated the orientations and magnitudes. And so this would look something like this. So in this particular point, I say it's a small magnitude and it's towards southeast.
So with magnitude, is the maximum magnitude you can say a single pixel is the width of the filter? Like, say you're just doing a 3 pixel. How when you think about magnitude, how would you say?
So the magnitude is how significant that point is on a border. So if I have a vessel, for example, let's say I have a border. If I'm applying on this border here, what I will get is I have definitely a vertical edge here, right? So it is significant, it is important, it's a very important edge. If you remember from lecture 3, I think, once we apply these filters on an image, we did the success buoy images, we could see that the vertical and horizontal edges. So once we apply that filter, this one, on the image, depending on the difference between right and left, you get a value.
So the higher the difference in intensities on a grayscale one, the more the magnitude.
Exactly. So if this value is a big value, it means you are on an edge. You are on a significant edge. It is clear that the right and left of this point are very, very different. So you have a very salient edge, which is standing out. Okay? So if you have a high magnitude, it means this is most likely a very strong edge in that particular location. Right? And once you have the magnitude, you also calculate the orientation. So now if you have an image which looks like this, and you take this point, you get the orientation in this direction with a high magnitude. But if you have some objects like that around it, you don't get a significant one. And if you get something like, because this is like another object, let's say the eyes, for example, and you get some small value in this direction, right? So in this particular point, you get this orientation and a good magnitude. So one of the ways that we can use this information is some method called histogram of oriented gradients. So what we do in this one is for every individual pixel, we calculate these orientations and create a histogram of them. So how many orientations can I have? From 0 to 360. So what I do is, it's too many. I bin them. I say, in this particular implementation, I say I have 9 bins. So I say 0 to 40. Anything that I see in this range, I say this is this bin. And then so on. And then you can separate your, you can bin them, like group them together. So any orientation that you have in a specific range, it falls into one of those ranges. So what we do here for HOG, for example, if I have a 64 by 128, I divide the image into blocks of 16 by 16. This is one implementation. You can have your own implementation. I divide the image into blocks of 16 by 16 with 50% overlap. So in this case, if I have a 64 by 128, I'm going to have 7 times 15 blocks, which is 105 blocks. In each block, I have a 2 by 2 cell. Each cell has a size of 8 by 8. And then I quantize the gradient orientations into 9 bins. And then I concatenate the histograms. So what I am doing here is having a 64 by 128 image converted into a feature vector of size 3780. So what am I doing? I'm taking my image, and these are the values that I have calculated using these equations. So these are, I have values and I have orientations for each individual pixel. So I take them into 2 by 2 and do 4 of these. So this is one cell, 16 by 16. So I have 2 by 2 here. So I should do 2 by 2. And then convert the values in each of them, whatever the orientation is, into these 9 bins. So I said if I have the orientation of 35 degrees, I say 35 is closer to which one? This one. So I add it to this bin. If I have a value 20 degrees, I add it to this bin. If I have 170, I add it to this bin. So then I create a histogram. I say I have a 0.5. Now this is the magnitude. I have 0.5 value for this one, and I have 0.7, I have 0.8. And what I do is I create a feature vector, size 3000 something, 700, and that image is now converted into histogram of oriented gradients. I'm not going to go into more details, but there is a video here. It's like an hour or two. You can watch it and see if you have any doubts. But what will it look like? If I just show it, can you say what this is, or it is too bright? It's a bike, right? So you can see how this works. Those oriented gradients are obviously creating an image of what is enough to say this is a bike. So if you have this image, in MATLAB, again, it's simple. You just call extract hawk features, and it just does it for you and extracts them for you. So if you have an image like this, you can display it like that.
Does that mean that it's becoming scale invariant as well?
No. No. We have another model called SIFT, Scale Invariant Feature Transform, which we'll talk about next week. In that model, it is a scale invariant to an extent, and the idea behind it is very, very simple. It's something called DOG, difference of Gaussians. So you remember we had those Gaussian filters that blurred images, right? So you remember if I do a small filter, I get a little blurriness, and if I do a bigger filter, I get a lot of blurriness. What this is in fact doing is the small blurriness is telling me about small details. And the bigger blurriness, so if you see an object in a bigger blurred image, it is a bigger object. That is why you still can see it. If it was a small object, it would be blurred out. So if you take those different Gaussian scales and deduct them from each other, you create edge maps. That is called a scale space, which is using scale invariant feature transform. So they do that, and they create scale invariance. And there is another step, which is for these orientations, once you calculate them, for each part, you align it towards the maximum orientation. So always you are looking at the maximum orientation. So if you see a line like that, and you detect that this orientation is the max, and you want to store that feature, you align it vertical. And if you have line like this, you again align it vertical. So now you're adding in rotation invariance to your model. So we will talk about it next week. So the basic idea here is that I converted an image to a feature vector. You have seen this before, like if I want to do text analysis. I give you 4 pages of text, and I ask you to count the word farmer, bank, water, loan, things like that. And you start counting. You say, okay, this text has 25 mentions of bank, 20 loan, no water, no farmer. This other text has like 20 farmer. So you count it, and then you calculate a frequency map. How often did you see that a specific word, right? So with this, you can create a feature vector again. So document 1 is now 0.5, 0.500. document 2 is 0.30, 0.60. So you are converting a big text into a feature vector. And if only these 4 keywords are enough, you have a good point to separate those texts from each other. You have a good starting point. So from now on, you have 4 points, and all you need to do is to find that line, where to draw that line. If there are too many mentions of a bank, it's probably about finance, this text. If there is too many mentions of farmer, it's probably about farming, right? So you can find that line. It's now much simpler. Instead of working with the whole text, you can start with a few words. Basically, this is the idea behind a text classification and search engines. This is very, very basic. There's a lot more to that. They do page ranking, they do other things. But this is the basic idea, word counting. You count the words in a text. So how can we do it in images? Let's say I have these images. What I do here is I extract some patches. Let's say magically, I know that these are the patches that I see in these 3 images. Right? So I have these, and I call them Universal Text-on Dictionary. I have a dictionary here now. You remember we had a dictionary, bank, farmer, things like that, but now they are visual dictionary. This is a dictionary of features. I have a dictionary, and then I start. If I apply this mask, look at it as a mask, and I multiply it in this area, I get a very high response, right? Because they look like each other. The zeros cover zeros and ones cover ones. So I get a good response. But if I apply something like this on that, I get a lot of zeros. So they don't match well. So in this method, I am converting and basically that image into a feature vector by counting the number of occurrences. So what I do is I have this filter, run it through my image, and I see I found 2,000 good matches. I run this one, and I say I found 3,000 good matches. I run this one, and this one, and this one. So now again, I have a feature vector. 2,000, 3,000, 2,000, 500, 200, 100, and so on. So I'm converting that big image into a set of values, some numbers. You can then normalize this number and use it for classification. So we are going back to the point that we had some values, and now we want to find that line. So the basic idea in image classification, using bag of words, because now I have a bag of words, I have a dictionary of features. I am going to find the occurrences, how many times have I seen them, and then find the values, convert them into feature vectors, and now draw the line. So I'm converting those numbers that the cat face had into a bunch of orientations, into a bunch of similarities with this dictionary of features. And I'm converting my image into a feature vector. This is another example. This is very visual. You don't get features like that in reality. But let's assume I have this bike and I have these features. So I can, again, convert them into a dictionary of features. Here, I'm not using any spatial information. I don't care where I see this tire. As long as I see it, or I don't know, the engine, as long as I see it, I say it's a match. I saw it, it's a 1. Or I saw 2 of this, it's a 2, and so on, right? So I have a dictionary, I compare them, and then I create a feature vector or a histogram. So this is what I use for classification instead of pixel values, right? So there are ways to keep the spatial information, but again, here is another video. You can watch it later to see more ideas about this. There are other ways to extract information, like blob detection. The idea behind blob detection is to use the features that we have learned, like color intensity, edge connections, and things we saw in segmentation, to find blobs in the image. A blob is basically an area in an image, a bounding box in the area in an image, which has a similar set of similarities. So they have the same texture, they have the same color, and so on. So one of the ways to detect numbers that you're holding is you can run a blob detector, find the blobs. One of the blobs is going to be the paper you're holding. And you have an estimate of how big that blob would be. And now you can use the blobs that are in that range, resize them, and send them to your optical character recognition to find the numbers on them. Instead of sending the whole image, which will not work if you have tried, you can try blobs. You can find the smaller areas, which make more sense to be a number. Again, there are differential methods and methods used based on local extrema. There is a code here for MATLAB we can use for blob detection. So the idea here, just to summarize it, is to extract some features. These features can be anything. They can be hog, which we discussed now. They can be blobs. It can be sift, surf, any other sort of features. We will talk about sift and surf later, but I mentioned it here because you can use them for your coursework if you want. They are also very simple. In MATLAB, you call it detect surf features, and it automatically does it for you. So for now, you can use it. Next week, we will go into detail about how exactly SIFT is working. Surf is a speeded up, robust features, yeah. And because SIFT is copyrighted, so last time I checked, MATLAB didn't have a direct implementation, but Surf is also supposedly faster because it uses integral images as well. But anyway, the idea here is you extract some features from your images, right? So I have 1,000 images of different classmates. So I extract, let's say, 200 features from each person, and then I create a dictionary of features. I say I have these 20,000 features. And then on any individual image of any person, you compare it with all those 20,000 features that you have stored and create a 20,000 dimensional feature vector. So this is a value that how similar this feature in that image is to the dictionary feature that I have. You count it. So if we make it again visual, if you have images like this, you are going to have a good response on facial features. If you have images like this, you are going to have something like that. This is again visual. So how do we actually do that? Once you have some data, what you do is, let's say I have 1,000 images, and I want to try and train a model to draw that line. So the whole goal is to convert your images into these feature vectors and draw the line, which is your classifier. So now if you see a new image, a new person, it says this is person 1 or person 2. If you have multi-classes, there are ways to deal with that. We will talk about it. So what I do is I have 1,000 images. I don't use all of my images for training my model, because then my model will be overfitted. It will be just memorizing things. We don't want our model to memorize. Computers are excellent in memorizing things. They are times better than humans. If you give your computer an image and 10 years later you go back, it has it. No changes. But if I show you an image and 2 days later I ask you, was there a giraffe in the image? I don't remember. So computers are excellent in storing and memorizing. But we don't want them to memorize. We want them to be able to understand what is inside those images. So what I do is, instead of giving all that 10,000 images that I have to my model, I keep some, let's say 70% for training my model. I keep 30% separate, never touch it. Don't use it for training my model. This is called a test set. I train my model, and then I test it on my test set and see how good I was. Now again, my model might be overfitted to that 70%. So what I do is I keep some percent of that 70% for validating my model. So I teach my model with 60% of images and test it with 10%. Okay, this is good, but I could do better. I retrain it now with another random 90% from that 70% and test it if I want to test it on my 30%. So the final result that I report is from unseen images. Sometimes in some implementations and some publications, they don't do validation. They just train on the training set and test on the test set. Some competitions that are online, they don't even give you their test set. They give you a training set and say, go and run your algorithm. And you run it, you train it, and then you submit your code, and then they test it on their own test set and give you the results. Because if you have the test set, you might do some tricks to win the competition. So some competitions do not give you even their test set. You have to submit your model. So what I do here is there is something called k-fold. For example, we can do 10-fold. I do training 10 times, each time on 90% of my training data, and test it on the 10% of my validation set. And then do retraining, do this several times, 10 times, and then report an average score. So that my model is not trained on only 90% of my, on the whole training set, and it's not overfitted. So, now that we know how to convert our images into features, basics, in the lab you will see some actual setup. You will download the Caltech 101 dataset. You will see the images. I have put some code for you how to extract them, how to read the classes, because that class is our label, right? So you know which label you are dealing with. Just before I forget about your coursework, first, please do not use anyone else's images in a sense that someone has done it, converted them to JPEG, and then put them in any format or folders, and they're just sharing with you. I appreciate that you're going to help each other, but one part of your coursework is for doing that, because you will see challenges. But I saw a problem there, and I couldn't help not mentioning it because it might be distracting others. If you have 100 folders that 20 of them are empty, what does it mean? You should eliminate them. Don't think about the numbers. They don't matter. If you have number 1, number 2, number 3, and there is no number 4, you don't need a class number 4. Forget about it. Your next class is number 5, then number 6. Because if a class is empty, then how do you want to train on it? How do you want to test on it? So if you have like 60 students participating in the challenge, in the photos, you need 60 classes. That label could be from 1 to 300. It could be anything. Imagine it's 1 lecturer, 2 student, 3 student, 4, I don't know, car, 4 motorcycle. So you are dealing with labels. So those numbers, don't let them be distracting. So in machine learning, we generally have 3 different sorts. Just a very general, broad way to put it. We have supervised learning, which for any image that I have a label. All of the images of me that you have in your coursework, they are labeled 1. They are in folder 1. Person 2, person 3, person 7. So you have labels. And the numbers don't matter. It's just a label. In unsupervised learning, you don't have labels. You have a lot of images, and you don't know who this person is. But you know that this person is not that person. That's what your model can learn, hopefully. You know you're looking for red images versus blue images. So you look for red and you look for blue. But you don't know red and blue. Your model is trying to understand it. So that is unsupervised learning. And then you have reinforcement learning, which is when you have an environment, and for example, the agent is learning from the environment. It is not supervised, but it has a reward function and penalizing. So it goes and hits a wall. So it learns that, okay, I can't go this way. So it has to turn back, and go, so it gets some reaction from the environment. In computer vision, we are mainly concerned with supervised and unsupervised, unless you are going to work with other sources of images. So, again, in supervised learning, our data have labels. In unsupervised learning, they don't have labels. Techniques for supervised learning, probabilistic models, neural networks, support vector machines, and for unsupervised learning, we know clustering, self-organizing maps, and things like that. So again, supervised learning, environment, teacher, learning system, and there is a desired response. So if we generate a response, and now we know the desired response. If there is no error, good. If there is an error, the learning system updates itself and keeps doing this until we reach even a number of iterations or everything is classified correctly. In unsupervised, you don't have the desired response. You have an environment and a learning system, and it tries to find something common in images in our group. For example, in k-means, you say, I want these images to be clustered into 4 different pixel values, 4 different colors. This is what you set up. The model now looks and sees what 4 can it find. You don't specifically say find blue and find green and find red. This is unsupervised. And the reinforcement where your agent learns from the actions in the environment. We also have semi-supervised, where you have some labeled pixels and you have some unlabeled pixels. But we are mainly concerned with these two for the purpose of this course. So the standard supervised learning pipeline, this is important. You have 2 steps, training and testing or predicting. In training, you have raw data, your images, and you have their labels. So you have images of me, for example. They are in 4,000 by 3,000 resolution. It's your raw data. And you know it is person 1. You extract some features. Let's say you extract Hawk features, for example. You extract SIFT features or whatever other sort of feature you like. And create a feature vector. Then you train your model. You evaluate your model. And if it is not good, you keep training different features, add different features, remove different features, change the parameters of your network. So you try to improve your model here. And once you have a final model, now you want to test it on unseen images. So new data comes in. There is an image. You don't know which person it is. It could be person number 27, could be 29, but you don't have the label. So it comes. The same feature extraction that you did before, you do it here. The same method you use for extracting features, you do it here. And your model generates a prediction and then generates a label. So you say, okay, I think my model thinks this is person number 7. And we talked about confusion matrices, right? So what you do, then you count them, how many mistakes you have, and report an accuracy. You say, my system detected person 1 as 27 5 times. So it's 5 mistakes. So you count all of the truly classified ones and the wrong classified ones and deduct. So this is generally the pipeline that you have. In deep learning, it's also similar, but there are small differences. In traditional computer vision, there are several ways. The methods that we are more concerned about are probabilistic models, support vector machines, neural networks, cascading classifiers, decision trees, and things like that. But because nowadays, most of the things that are done in computer vision are deep learning, and the deep learning models are like a state-of-the-art times better than traditional computer vision models, I will not stress out the rest of the models. I will just talk about neural networks. Just mention the rest, what they mean, so that you can implement them in your code. But main focus here is on neural networks. So we have probabilistic approaches. Just again, for simplification, look at this image. You say, I have this scenario, and then I have, let's say I have a very good segmentation model, which says this is the tennis player, this is the racket, and this is a lemon. So it doesn't make any sense. This is not possible because in your environment you don't play with a lemon. You probably have a tennis ball. So it has some semantic context, for example. So the idea is similar. It is not exactly like that, but the idea is you have a probability, like the Bayes equation. You have probability of A given B times probability of B equals probability of B given A times probability of A. So there are probabilistic inference models, naive Bayesian, ideal Markov models, and maximal entropy. Let's get to neural networks. Let's have a quick break, and I start neural networks bits, right? Be back in 5. Oh, hey, how are you doing?
I take it you filled your stuff.
Yes, I have.
That's fine. I take it you've got the license.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was surprised. But I don't think I'm going to use it in the end.
It's something rather nice in the nature that you can do once you send it to Google, describing simulators, there's a bunch of good ones. Yeah. I think GTA is nobody cares about the rules in the game, everyone is not going. But you're not going to do it on your online mode, so you're the only map person in the game. Yeah. But the rest, but it's not that good for the purpose, I would say. Once you said GTA, what I thought you have in mind was probably they are going to give you the metadata. They are going to give you don't need to do vision. So they are basically going to tell you, this is the coordinate of your car, and this is the coordinate of a red light, and it is red.
Yeah.
So I thought what you're going to do, they're going to give you the metadata, and you're going to use it to drive the agent. So that would be a different thing than vision. If you have the metadata, the whole purpose of vision is to create that metadata. For that, GTA is not launched. But if you have this, that could be a very interesting project, but not vision.
It's like test out like separate language. I don't know. Yeah.
Of course, you have to you will see that probably it's not in your interest.
Yeah.
It might not. The thing is, those images are quite different. So the image is only in a group photo with the individual images medium theory. Your model might perform lower than if you don't add it. But you will tell me.
Yeah. Okay.
Cheers.
I'm good at this question from our thesis. So I'm trying to do, I'm taking the time series of stocks, different factors, and I'm converting them into retribution applications to use CNN to basically classify what I own or sell stock. So my question is, how did you distribute this? You use a transform basically, so if we have 63 points on this graph, what it will do is take the Euclidean distance between each 2 points and therefore create a more important picture of what's happening with the behavior neural network. It's supposed to be more. Yes. That's a good question now. I'm still working on that. But the thing that I came across is I'm trying to do something very similar to the coursework, so different angles of the same person, the same stock. But I've been told that since it's really different graphs, the CNN will not be able to learn multiple inputs to the graph.
Because I work in this area, and you can simply download the last 10 years data. It shouldn't have you can do it like hourly, minutely,
matter if something is like P or something's volatility is so these are for the different things that might affect your price. So the idea is that to learn for like Monday what happened with the beta, what happened with the P, what happened with the volatility. So
One way to go is once you have this four elements for each, and then you have another comparison here.
I don't have one of
Yes.
Are you expecting just one type of classification method, or do you have to use different classification methods?
You have to use different classification methods, and you have to use different feature types.
How many are you expecting?
It is written, I don't remember, I think 2 different classifiers, 2 different features, I think. But it is explained in the first one.
And the write-up.
No, 2 pages is not enough. 10, 15 is not. Yeah. I'm not going to count it.
Yeah.
Like, okay, it's at 50 pages, this is awesome, but 2 pages is definitely too short. It won't, you at least need a few pages for comparison of your results and a confusion matrices, different models and things like that.
Because the other word is marking was from different, so this is really clarifying.
Yeah. And that's your selling point. I will start with your report and then go to your code. Okay, shall we start? We have about 50 more slides to go through. I'll rush. Okay, are you ready? So, the next few slides are about neural networks. How many of you know neural networks? And how many don't know neural networks? Okay, so I start from the basic idea of neural networks. I skip these parts, which you can read later, so this is the biological background. Basically, a neural network is inspired from neurons and from the way they interact with each other. So if you have a set of neurons, you will see how they interact with each other. We talked about it in the first lecture, and I will briefly go through it. But generally, computers are much better than human brain in some areas. For example, in playing chess, nowadays computers are much better. In the game Go, computers are better. They defeated the champion. In this IBM Watson, in a competition in 2011. It's a nice video you can watch later and laugh. It's a game that the computer defeats humans as well. And in solving equations, the computers are much better. In memorizing images, computers are much better. But in some areas, they are not as good. Where they need to understand, they are not as good. They need to be explicitly trained and instructed. So in an experiment in '96, what they did was they trained pigeons to see whether they are good in classifying images. So they were trained on 2 different artist images, and then they were compared with a computer program. So the interesting thing is the computer is 100% accurate on the images that it has seen before, but like it was random, 50% accurate on the images that it hadn't seen at the time. And the pigeon was like 90%, 95% accurate on the ones that it had seen before, and 85% on the one that it hadn't seen before. So the pigeon could extract features. It could see things, patterns, the differences between the styles of the 2 different artists. The computer couldn't, because the computer is just looking at pixel values, and they don't make a lot of sense to it. So the idea of neural networks is an idea the idea was to see how biology works, how brains work, that you're so good in this area. So the starting date, the early date was understanding neurons. And we talked about this. The neuron is made of a cell body, some hair-like dendrites, which are the input channels, and the axon, which is the output cable, and it branches out and connects to other neurons. So the idea came from simulating this. And we talked about the role of a neuron, the different parts, what they do. You can read more and watch more videos on YouTube if you are interested. But the general idea is that we have a cell body, we have some input, and we have one output, right? So we have some input, a system, and the output. The way the neurons work is it's a complex summing or addition of the input values and generates an output. So once there is significant excitatory connections to it, it starts to excite other neurons in the neighborhood. And when there are inhibitory inputs, it starts to inhibit the neighboring neurons. So what they wanted to do basically was, how can we do this? The idea, again, you have a system, you have some input, you add that input, and you generate an output. The interesting thing here is that it needs to reach to a certain excitation level to start firing. The neuron doesn't start firing if there is a very small amount of excitatory signal to it. So we add a bias here. And the other thing is that the system has a limit. It doesn't fire like 10 million times a second. It has a limit. So we have to limit the output here as well. So for limiting that, what we do is we call it an activation function or squash function or transfer function. But now let's make it a bit look more mathematical. I have a set of inputs. I have a set of weights. What do these weights mean? It means how important each input is. How much is the weight of that input? How should I start firing, or this is not an important input? So these weights define the importance of this input. And if I multiply these weights times the input, so think of these as pixel values in computer vision. So you have a 100 by 100 image. You have 10,000 inputs. Forget about feature extraction. Imagine we are just giving it the raw pixel values. Or if you have extracted your features, now you have whatever. You have 3,700 hog features. Each of them have values, right? So each of your feature vectors is 3,700 dimensions. So your input is 3,700 dimensions. So each of these values, 0.5, 0.7, whatever value you had, is this one. X1 is 0.5, X2 is 0.7, and so on. So this, for simplicity, imagine as a pixel value. It's 250, 0, 280, 200, not 280 we can't have, 210, 60, 70, and so on. So these are the pixel values. And then we have the weights. We multiply these weights in this input. We add a bias, and we send it to an activation function, and we generate the output. So that's neural networks.
The activation function that you use is always like a sigmoid function. You don't use any of the linear type functions.
We can use a lot of different ones. Like in convolutional neural networks, they mainly use ReLU these days, which is a rectified linear unit. But for the sake of this one, we stick with a simple 0, 1, and then we talk about sigmoid, and then other tangent, hyperbolic, and other activation functions can also be used. Yeah. Anyway, so what I do is the U that I'm generating is the sum of X W's, and then I create this, add the bias, and send it to the activation function. And this M is the dimension of the input data. Right? Any questions here? So this activation function can be different forms. We will talk about it. But the idea is very simple. You have some input values, pixel values, your feature vector values, but they're all of the same size. So you can, one image cannot be 2,000 feature size and the other one will be 100. It won't work. Everything has to be the same size, right? So you give these values as input, and then you have the output. Sum of these values multiplied by their weights plus bias, and then the result from the activation function. We will run an exercise on this to make sure we all understand. So as you can see, it's very similar to the neuron. It has a set of inputs. It does a sum of those inputs. There is an activation function which limits it. There is a bias which it needs to start firing if we are not going over, and then it generates an output. And this output now can be connected to other neurons as well. But we don't care. We are just talking about one single neuron. So as you can see, it's the same idea. This idea was presented in 1958 by Rosenblatt. And here is a bit about him, if you are interested. So his work was perceptron, a single-layer neural network, just one neuron. And it was quite a big idea at the time. People loved it, and they thought now we are simulating the brain and every problem is solved, until there were challenges. But let's get to this simple example. So what do we want to achieve with a neural network? Let's say I have some data, and I want to find this line, right? So this is my class 1, the green ones, and the red ones is the class 2. So what I'm looking for is finding this line. This is a simple task. I can do it manually. So if I have a line like x1 minus x2 minus 2, I manually generated this line, which is the blue line. You can see that it is separating these two classes very well. All right? So if I have a, how does it separate them? Let's say I put 0, 0. 0 minus 2 is minus 2. So I'm getting a negative value, so the class is 0. So I'm calling this bit 0. This is class 0, this is class 1. Now let's try this one, 0 minus 2.5. 0 minus 2.5, it's 2.5, minus 2 is 0.5, so it's greater than 0. So it is 1. So it is this class, right? It's very simple. You have a line, you put these values, so 2.10. 2.1 minus 0 minus 2 is 0.1, is greater than 0, so I'm class 1. So it is correctly classifying all my data. So this line is what we are after. Now I just drew it, but what I want is a way to come up with this line from my data. I don't have these values in reality. What I'm looking for is these weights. What I'm looking for is this minus 2 plus 1 minus 1. The bias and these values, W1, W2. So how do I do it? This is the way in 1958. This simple algorithm was the state of the art and was all over the news. What we do, it says, start with a randomly chosen weight vector. So I don't have the weights that I need, so I start with a randomly chosen number. Anything. We can choose any number, right? And while there are input vectors that are misclassified by the weights that I have randomly selected, so this n is the repetition number, do this simple few lines. Let's say xn is a misclassified input vector. I had a value, I multiplied it in the line, and it fell on the wrong side of the line. So it is wrong. So what I will do here is I will update my weights. What I do is w iteration n plus 1 equals to w in iteration n, previous weights that I had, plus a learning factor, eta here. You can define this. They usually start with a bigger number, and through learning they decrease it. Then you have the error function, en, which e is the desired output minus produced output. And then you have xn, which was your input, misclassified input. So what I do is I have 10 different points. I take random weights. I start with the first point. I run it. If it is correct, good. Take the second one. Run it. If it is correct, good. If it is not correct, misclassified, I update the weights and then take the third one, take the fourth one, take the fifth one, and do this. Okay, now all of them done, start again. Take the first one, run it, take the second one, run it. If it is correct, nothing needs to be done. If it is wrong, I update the weights. And I keep doing these iterations. I do it 10,000 times, for example, until all of my items are classified correctly. So this is the idea behind perceptron. So this is the desired value. I say class 1 and class 2. I think the best way is that you grab a piece of paper and a pen and run this simple experiment with me now. Can we do that? Because it just gives you a good idea, and for those who already know, it's a good exercise. All right. Ready? Let's start. So we have an example. It says, let's consider a simple classification problem where the input space is one-dimensional space, a real line. So class 1, I have two values. One, x is 0, 5. Let's say this is 0. X is 0.5. And the other one is 2. And I have class 2. One is -1 and -2. So what I am looking for, this is class 2. And I define d equals to 0. And these two are class 1, which is d equals to 1. So what I'm looking for is basically finding a line that separates these two classes. Any line would do. So I'm looking for something like this. Right? So let's start. I give you the initial W as -1.5 and -2 transposed. And the learning rate for simplicity is 1. So how you can show your images is, isn't it visible? Yeah. Sorry. So they are here. The values are written. Is it better? Okay. And the activation function is a simple one. It's, I say it's 1 if v is greater than 0, and it is 0 otherwise. So it's a very, very simple thing. The main important point for you to start is the way you represent your images. So add your bias here. So I would say this one would look like, so my x is like this and my y is like this. So x is, the first point is 1, this is my bias, 0.5 transpose. The second one is 1 minus 1. Third one is 1, 2. Fourth one is 1 minus 2. And the y, so this is 1. The minus 1 is 0. I'm just scrambling my data. 2 is 1. Minus 2 is 0. So this is your training images. So this one is just a bias. And this is your output, the desired output that you want, which is actually D. So how do we do it? And this is your activation function. Yep?
Sorry, so the second one in the X tuple is the bias?
Yeah, the first one is bias.
First one is bias.
And the second one is the value, 0.5. This is minus 1. This is 2. This is minus 2. So how do I start? Just doing the first line will solve it for you. So what I do is I say my equation. What was my equation? These two. This is my update rule. This is the only important thing that I want. So what I want is that my weights minus 1.5 minus 2 times the first training value. Minus 1.5 minus 2 times 1.5. What is the value? Is minus 1.5 minus 1 is minus 2.5, right? It was negative 2.5. So what I have here, my activation function says, is my number greater than 0? Is minus 2.5 greater than 0? No, so it's 0. So I'm generating 0. But the actual value for this one was 1. So I'm wrong. What do? I update it. So W iteration 2 is W iteration 1, or 0, plus learning rate is 1, the error that I generated. What is the error? The error is D minus Y. What is D? Is 1. What is Y? 0. So my error is 1, my learning rate is 1, xn plus wn. So now the w is updated to minus 0.5 minus 1.5. Is this clear? Could everyone do this? Because this is the more important step. The rest is just repeating this. So let's do it here as well. Or is it clear? Clear? Yeah? Anyone dares to say it's not clear? Okay, so again, you put that in your activation function, the weights multiplied by the input. You start with the first input. It was misclassified. You update the weights, and you have now a W1. So we call this one W0, the random initialization, and now we have W1. So I take W1, and go to the second example. Because we don't have much time, I'm going to go a bit faster. Otherwise, I would ask you to do the whole thing. So we have updated weights time the second input. The class that we come up with is 1 because the value is greater than 0 this time. It's minus 0.5 plus 1.5. So it's greater, it's 1. But the class we had is actually 0. So again, we are wrong. But this time, D is 0. Y is 1. D minus 1 is minus 1. You see the difference? Previous one, because the desired output was 1, and I got 0, this error was 1. But here, because it is 1 and I wanted 0, it is minus 1. So this value keeps adding and deducting from the weights until it reaches somewhere that everyone is correctly classified. So this is very important. So W2 is W1 plus eta 0 minus 1 times x. And this is my third one now. So I take this third one, update the W. I update the W because it was wrong. I run the third one, which is 1, 2. And again, it is wrong. So again, I update the weights, and then I come with these numbers. So minus 0.5, 1.5. Right? Now this is correct. And if you run it through the rest of them again, they're all correct. So I found a line. It's somewhere here. Or more specifically, something like that. So I found a line that is now separating my images. That's it. That's perceptron. Very simple. But the problem is if I have, let's define linear, let's define linear separable. If two classes are linearly separable, it means you can draw a single line and separate them. Right? So you can draw a single line and separate those classes. This is called linearly separable. And if there are something like this, a single straight line is not going to be able to classify them, so they are not linearly separable. Sometimes changing the dimensionality of the data helps with this problem. So if you have this image in the left and then you convert it into polar coordinates, for example, you are already solving it. You are making it linearly separable. Sometimes changing coordinates matter. Sometimes it doesn't work, but sometimes it does. But the problem is that with perceptron, if it is now a proven theorem that if a problem is linearly separable, a perceptron can solve it. So perceptron is very, very strong for linearly separable problems, but the problem raised in 1969 that people said perceptron cannot solve the problems that are not linearly separable. They come up with this example, XOR problem. So you know what XOR is, right? So if you have 0, 0, the output is 0. If you have 1, 1, it is 0. And if they are not equal, it is 1, right? It's exclusive. So one line cannot separate it, and this was the failure of perceptron. Unfortunately, the author of perceptron died, so couldn't come up with an answer for that. But later, they said, okay, let's say this line separates this from the rest of the world, and this line separates this from the rest of the world. So what I need is one perceptron here for this line, one perceptron here for this line, and then I can put them together. So this is one perceptron, another perceptron connected, one connected to another neuron or another perceptron. And that is multi-layer perceptron. So you are adding more neurons, increasing the number of perceptrons that you have, and it will help you solve many, many more problems, right? So multi-layer perceptron is generally a generalization of the single-layer perceptron. It has one input layer, one output layer, and several or one or two or several hidden layers. So we call them hidden, the ones that are in the middle. Input, hidden, output. It's just the terminology. The other reason is a bit more difficult to exactly understand what is happening. But the idea is the same. How do we train them? It's the same. We start with feeding our input. We start with a random weight, multiply them, generate an output. If the output is correct, bingo. If it is not correct, we come back and start. We update the weight and start. But the problem here is we have more than one weight. Here we had only one. But in multi-layer perceptron, each neuron has its own weights, right? So we have to deal with more weights. So that's the only difference. So we have one feed-forward pass, where I put my randomly initialized weight, I put the input vector, multiply them through all the network, generate an output. If it is correct, good. If it is not, I update all the weights, come back to the first layer, generate new weights for each perceptron, and then go back again. So there is a good video to explain what backpropagation is if you don't know, but the idea is basically very simple. You have a network. Each of them have their own activation function. They are usually the same, but they can be different. And you have inputs. So what I do is I have these random weights. I multiply them, run through the activation function. So this one is x1 w x1 1, x2 plus x2 w x2 1, and activation function. This one, same. This one, same. And I keep doing that. Now the next layer is the output of this one, times the weight from this one. So x1 is not directly connected to this. So the output of this neuron is connected. And I multiply and keep going and keep doing that. So I have this one, this one, this one, which is the w times this activation function. Now I calculate the error. I say I was wrong. I calculate the error and backpropagate and keep updating each weight. So it may look a bit more complicated, but it is not really that complicated. So you have the weights, your forward pass, and then this is the weight updating. So it is the same, but here you have more weights to update. It's not only one weight. So the idea is the same. You have a forward pass and you have a backward pass. In forward pass, you multiply your input in your randomly initialized weight. In the backward pass, you update those weights. So don't worry about these equations. They won't be on your exam, and there is a video here if you want more details to see how exactly it's happening. The method they use is mainly gradient descent. So neural networks, the way to set them up is you can use hyperbolic tangent for activation in hidden neurons. You can use log-seq for output layer, depending on what you want to do with your neural network. There are some rules for detecting the number of hidden neurons and number of hidden layers, and you can have a look at this stuff. And you can use regularization, which we will talk about a bit more in when we talk about deep learning. So in MATLAB, you just call NN start, and it generates a graphical user interface for you. And you can choose the number of layers you want, the activation functions you want, and you feed your input data and press run. So it's, and keep the number of iteration. You define how many iterations you want your network. So you need a stopping criteria. One way is to say run this 10,000 times. I don't care, I don't have much more time. So just run 10,000 times. The other way is to say run until the error is lower than a specific number. So in most cases, you will not get a 100% accuracy on your model. So you cannot keep running forever because sometimes your model is not the exact fit to your data. And no matter how long it runs, it will never be zero error. So you don't do that. And you can also use regularization, dropout. In convolutional neural networks, there are techniques for avoiding overfitting, but we will talk about them later. So just to give you again another idea of how it works, one of the data sets, for example, in computer vision is MNIST, which is a data set of digital characters. There are a lot of handwritten digital characters you can download. The data set is online, publicly available, and you can train your model. So for example, in this one, the inputs are 28 by 28 pixels, and you can feed them directly to your network one way. The other way is you can extract features from them, create a feature vector, and then feed that feature vector to your network. For convolutional neural networks, you usually feed your image directly. You do not extract features. But for neural networks or for vector machine, you can extract features, create a feature vector, and then send it to your classifier. The difference in convolutional neural networks and neural networks is convolutional neural networks have a lot of layers. And they create those kernels which we are here manually applying. We are extracting hog features. We are running edge detection. In convolutional neural networks, those filters are built in. The model learns them from the data. So we don't usually use those filters in convolutional neural networks. We give directly the pixel values. But here you can do either way.
So is it more of a descriptive term, sort of, is it once you add enough layers, it sort of becomes a convolutional neural network, or is there something else?
There are other things. Yeah, there are other things. Like they have, we will talk about it later, but there are other things. It's not exactly the same. You have pooling, you have, different concepts. So, but they are very similar. So what we have is if my image is 28 by 28 and I want to feed the image directly to my network, I will have 784 something input neurons. So each pixel is one neuron. And then I decide that maybe I need, 15 layers, and then I need another layer with 20 hidden neurons, and I need another layer with 200, whatever I like. And then the output is 10 different outputs, one for each class. So what I will give it as a label to my network is if I have an image that is 5, the output that I have here, my output for that particular one will be 0, 0, 0, 0, this is 4, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and then the rest are 0. So this is the output. This is the way I label my data. I say everything is 0 except 5. So if my images are all starting from 0, I start from 0. So this is how I generate those labels. And as the output, ideally what I will see is if I give it a number 5, this is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0. But you won't see that. This is going to be something like 0.1. This is going to be 0.3, this is going to be 0.2, this is 0.5. And then you say, okay, this is bigger than the rest, this is higher, so this is probably a 5. Depends on the activation function that you use. You can use softmax, for example, in deep neural networks as well. So this is how a neural network basically works. So in MATLAB, you can also play with it if you like. There are some data sets you can use, like wine data set. It is not images, it is just some feature vectors like the age, the quality that has been associated with. They have different values. And you can use net equals pattern net, and then different parameters you can look at an entrain tool. And it creates for you a prediction. So it also creates the confusion matrix with this function. So you can see how many of them were correctly classified. Here is more details. You can also use neural networks for regression. The regression is when you have a bunch of lines and you want to find a function that is connecting those lines. And you're trying to avoid overfitting. You do not want all the lines connected and so on. So you can also run this example to see how neural networks work on something like that. So back to classification problem. We learned about how we initialize those weights randomly, and then our neural network learns through experience, through going through the data. It learns to draw a line. But depending on the initial values that we give our network, this line might be different. It might be something like this, something like this, something like this. So it might produce a different result. So people were thinking, which line is the best? So the line that I come up, depending on where I draw that line, I might get different results. So this is where support vector machines come in handy. So you have these lines, and the goal is to find the optimal line. I won't go through details. I don't expect you to understand the exact details, but I will give you the general idea. Again, we have a line, any line. We have some input values, for example. We multiply those values into the line, and we have an activation function to see if it is positive, it's class 1, if it is negative, it's class 0. So we have a line. The goal is to find the optimal line. So the idea is we find a line that has the maximum possible distance from the closest vectors to the line. So let's call these vectors, feature vectors. So I want to the maximum distance, right? So in support vector terminology, they call these support vectors. So it is supporting this line, they're closest to that line, and they're called support vectors. So the goal is to find the line that maximizes this distance. So if I have a line here, you can see this distance is less. If I have a line here, it's the max. So I'm trying to find the one that maximizes this distance. So again, I have some definitions. I have a functional margin, I have a geometric margin. Then you can define the geometric margin as a relationship of a functional margin over the distance of this object with the support vector with the line. And it's an optimization problem. It's a constrained optimization problem that you can run. You have to minimize 1 over 2 W transpose W subject to these conditions. You don't, as I said, this is not a machine learning course, but I just want you to know what a support vector machine is. The idea is to find the optimal line. So you can solve this optimization problem, but you don't have to for this course. Anyway, once you solve this problem, you find the optimal hyperplane. It gives you the W and B. So you have the optimal hyperplane that maximizes the distance to the support vectors. So it draws the best line. So it draws a line here. But now there are other things that we have to consider. If I have some data that is here, so what do? Do I draw a line like that? Or do I keep my line the way it is? The general idea is we try to go as simple as possible. We try to, always a straight line is preferred. So if we do that and we draw a line here, we might be misclassifying many more. So this is called overfitting. So I don't want to overfit to my training data. Maybe this is this person knew the bank manager. Maybe there is an there is an exception here. We don't have to change our model because of one exception. So we call it a soft margin. We accept some training error. We say, okay, I'm fine with having some error. I don't want to destroy my whole model. So sometimes transferring your data into a higher dimension changes things. You can, like previous example that you took your data to a polar dimensionality, you could change things. So sometimes you can do that. In support vector machines, we have kernels. It doesn't have to be a straight line multiplication. It can be a kernel. You can have polynomial. You can have radial Gaussian radial basis function. So you can have different kernels as well. And this changes the modality. The interesting thing is if you want to solve this XOR problem with a neural network, it may take about 1,000 iterations until it converges and finds the proper lines, the proper values that you need, all of the weights. It's only a very small network. But with a support vector machine, it's just an equation. So it's just a kernel, sine minus x1 times x2. So you convert your data, you change it from 0, 1 to minus 1 and 1, and then you multiply these values with each other. So it's a very simple kernel. So at the time, support vector machines were much more accurate than neural networks, and the idea of neural networks almost was dying, and people didn't do neural networks anymore because it was proven that support vector machines are a better classifier. Until very recently, in 2013, if you want, as you can see, you need 1,000 iterations to just solve a simple problem. So you can imagine how many iterations you are going to need if you have a bigger network. And updating all of those weights is going to be a very, very time-consuming problem. As I said, when I was doing my PhD, running one run through my code would take about 2 months. So because I had a lot of weights and I wasn't using a GPU, it was back in 2008. So I had to, if I wanted to simulate something like neural networks, one run would take a lot of time. So it was very, very insufficient. So I had to be very careful with what I'm trying to run. I run it, and then like 1 week later, I realized, oh, there is a bug in my code. Okay, stop. Now let's start again. So there were those problems, but later, people started using GPUs, and then things changed. So once you have a GPU, you can run in parallel, and the code that would take 2 months now takes 1 hour. So now you can just run it, and then see your errors and update it, and then things changed very, very quickly. Is there a question there?
Yes, sorry. My question is, when does the algorithm decide to ignore the error, and when does it decide to take to the higher dimension and go around?
It doesn't decide. You have to set those parameters. You have to decide. So, yeah.
When you say that support vector machine was better for classification, do you mean for classification of images or more in general?
Generally, it was a better classifier. Most people were using support vector machines.
Especially because it was faster.
It was faster and it was more accurate. The results you get also was better. So on my model, I was using a biologically inspired model, and on top of it, so the feature extraction was similar to Gabor filters that I talked about, but on top, I needed a classifier. And everyone was using support vector machine instead of a neural network, because they say neural network is biologically inspired, but it is not as accurate as support vector machine.
With the kernel, is that another decision you make yourself?
Yes. Yes. So let's continue here. So support vector machines were very good, but the thing with them is that they're binary classifiers. They draw a line. So what do I do if I have 3 classes? So there are 2 ways to go around it. One is called 1 against all, and one is called 1 against 1. So if I have 3 classes, one way is to train a support vector machine that says, this is class 1 or not class 1. Another classifier, this is class 2 or not class 2. And another one, this is class 3 or not class 3. The other one would be a pairwise, 1 to 1. I say, between 1 and 2, this is 1. Between 1 and 3, this is 1. Between 1 and 4, this is 4. And then do a majority voting. I say 75% these classifiers said this is 1, so this is 1. And you can do it that way. Again, in MATLAB, it is called SVM model equals FitC SVM. And you give your input, your training images or input, and you give your labels. And you decide on your kernel function, which is in this case is a radial basis function. And you give your class names. And then once this is created, it takes a while and it generates those lines. And then you say, okay, now predict. And now you're basically giving it a new item, and it multiplies it on your line with the kernel that you have decided, and it generates a label and gives you a score, how likely.
How scalable SVM is, because I think SVM is very expensive. It's calculating pairwise distance all the time. So when you have data size huge, which means SVM can be very slow.
Relatively, in comparison to neural networks, SVM is faster. But because in convolutional neural networks nowadays we are working with GPUs, they are always preferred. So again, now SVM is not really that useful. In your coursework, you will be implementing a neural network, a support vector machine, and a convolutional neural network. And you will see the difference in performance. That's one of the reasons for your coursework. So you will be able to compare, you will see the speeds, you will see the accuracy. And if you have multiple classes and you want to use SVM, you can call the fitCEOC. fitCECOC function, and there is help for that, so you can see the parameters that it has. So I will be quick to just wrap up what other sorts of classifiers are. We have cascading classifiers, as we discussed previously, for like R-like features. You have a set of classifiers that are cascading. They are like, okay, does this look like a nose? Yes, no. Does it look like an eye? Yes, no. Are they connected to each other? Yes, no. And then you have some cascading classifiers that are on top of each other, following each other. And so the way they work is you start with trying to remove a lot of negative examples. So if something doesn't look like a face at all, you quickly throw it away. Okay, this is not a face. Your code quickly throws it away. But the parts that look like a face, then they go through more detail. So this makes the computations less. So here is an example for R-like features in cascading classifiers for face detection. To see when you call that function in MATLAB, how does it detect faces? You can go through that. And in MATLAB, the function train cascade object detector has 3 types of features. You can give it R-like features, which we talked what they are. Remember those boxes, the rectangular boxes that look like face parts. We had the local binary patterns, LBP, which we discussed when we were talking about texture. You remember? We had those rotating numbers for texture. And the HOG, histogram of oriented gradients, which we talked about today. So you can give these as parameters and see how it works. So this is another example, which you have seen. The HOG features are useful for detecting objects, such as people and cars. You can use these HOG features to find people in your images. MATLAB has a tool called Training Image Labeler. You can label your images with this tool. So you say you have 1,000 images. You can extract like each of your images, put all together in that, and then just label them. So for example, I want to detect cancer in my images. I load images and then annotate them. I say, okay, this box is cancerous, and then next image, this box, next image, this box. So it's a very easy way to label your images or annotate your images or specific parts of that image. It's a useful tool. You can use for cascading object classifier for training it. So the other classifier is decision tree. They are based on a bunch of decisions that the code has to make. So so they have input, output, non-terminal nodes, terminal nodes, and branches. So it's a simple example. You are going to a party. Do you have prior commitment? Yes or no? Distance, long, short. So you make a decision based on a set of decisions that you need. So decision trees this is the idea. And in MATLAB, you can call fitC tree, and you give your input and labels, and it learns it. So if you put some decision trees together, you have a tree random forest. So it is supposed to take a polling on the different trees that you have. Here are some coursework hints. Abby has also some instructions for those who are going to submit their coursework in Python. She will be with us in a second. Just give you some ideas for your coursework. Your coursework, the most important part is your report. I will start with your report. I will see what you have done. Go through it. You're trying to sell it, right? So try to make it look good. Advertise a bit. Try to show what you have done. A 2-page report is not going to do it. You need more in that. You need confusion matrices, you need comparisons, you need to say, I did support vector machine with hog feature, this is my result. I did neural network with, I don't know, SIFT feature, this is the result, this is a comparison of that with that. So it's very simple. The coursework is simple. You have to just take the ideas that we have, you have those images, and run them. In the lab tonight, you see a classification example. So basically, I have written the code for you. All you need to do is to take those images and replace them into your folders and see how things work, how they don't work. You almost know everything you need to know for starting your coursework, including creating your data set and classifiers, support vector machine, neural networks. You have the code in MATLAB. You can simply run them. There are examples in the lab for you. But the convolutional neural network part is still for lecture 7, so we will also talk about that. So by the time we reach there, hopefully you have all done your coursework. And if there are any, So there are some hints here. You can look at them later to see what is of use to you. And this is the way your code is going to be tested. And last but not least, your classifier is not expected to work 100% correctly. It is, if you reach 90-something%, very well done. But you won't be able to solve this problem. Maybe you will, I don't know, but it's not expected from you to solve it. It's expected to you to try it. And there may be a question from your coursework, like how did you deal with that challenge in your coursework, so that in this way your coursework has more weight than just the exam. I'm making it easier for you. So, and there may be not, I don't know. Actually, the questions are designed and submitted already. So, so what we have is, you can, in your code, you can compare different classifiers, different sorts of features. Some of you have some questions. Can I use group photos in training my network? Feel free to do that, of course. It may improve or make your network worse. I don't know. You can try, and you will report that. You say, if I use the group photos in individual folders, this is the result I get. If I don't use it, this is the result I didn't get, and so on.
So the main thing was about scaling, because the videos are like 720 by 720, and then so when you take out the face, it comes to be like 110 to about 115 on average, 515. When it comes to taking individual photos, because they're in a much higher format, the face is much larger, and it actually takes a much larger proportions. How do you automatically scale it? Because that's where a sort of
Yeah. Okay. Another. Yeah, that's a good question. And so the other thing is for undergrads, there there is a student survey. You can go online, and if you show that you have done it, you will get a free drink. So go and do it. But generally speaking, if your university has higher ranking, it is better for you in the future, because in 10 years, if you say I'm from the #1 university in London, you will be prouder. So try to be nice once you go and write about your university. Anyway, about your question, you can estimate the resolution, but I'm not going to answer that. So it's an important thing that your images, the resolution of your images is very, very important. You should not work with the original images. How should I? Okay, okay, Abby. Hi. Ah, da, da.
Thanks, I sent you the.
No problem. How are you?
Good, you right?
Good, thank you. So this is it, right?
Thanks.
Is it working? Yeah, good.
Thank you. Okay, so first I'll talk about the Python submissions, and for MATLAB I'll talk about it a bit later in the slides. So firstly, with Python, I think we want you to be able to run all of your script in a virtual environment. So when testing, we are able to do the same. So what happens is each of you might decide to have your own different versions of each of the packages, libraries that you're using. Becomes a little tedious when it comes to marking, and I also feel like it's really good practice if you can have different environments set up with different versions, so you can test how it works with one and then revert back to another one if it doesn't work. So I think it's a great thing. So these slides will be up on Moodle. I've put a link to using Anaconda, so most of you should be using Conda. So Conda has virtual environments that you can create. So I've put a link to a great blog post that talks about basically everything. And then this is a screenshot that I prepared. So the top one, that is the setup file.sh. It can be text as well. So that is basically that's what we want to run when I start to mark. So the conda env create -f environment.yml. So the environment.yml is the second screenshot, which has all of the packages along with the version numbers that we want to run. So I mentioned Python 3.5.4. You can do whichever version you want. And then the channels, I've mentioned default. So if you want Conda Forge or if you have other channels, you can mention it. If you have priority over one of the other channels, then please ensure that you mention that. So, and then going back to the top slide, so that's after creating the environment, and I will activate the CV coursework and I'll go inside it and start to run your testing scripts. So, and then for those of you who are not using Conda and just using a system Python, I've put another link to where you can set up a virtual env with pip. And this is a quick screenshot to show you how I created a virtual env and then I've activated it. And then finally, can't show you, but I've said pip install -r requirements.txt. So the requirements.txt is the file that I want to have with all of the library names and then the versions, so I can recursively install everything. So that's for Conda and pip. And yeah, so the few general points about your entire code structure is read the instructions